Gwent offers a rich historical tapestry with important sites, some of them thousands of years old. It's a rich landscape which has inspired generations of writers. To many, it's also a land of mystery. And few mysteries have attracted more intense speculation over centuries than the quest for Arthur. Many think that quest starts and ends in Gwent. Insofar as we can tell, our best image of the historical Arthur is probably a 5th, 6th century warlord resisting the advancing Saxons. Now we know that in Wales in the 4th, 5th and 6th century, a number of hill forts were reoccupied. And that could make a site like this one of interest to anyone trying to reclaim Arthur. This is the Lodge Hill fort above Caerleon. Certainly there was considerable interest when a few years ago we excavated this site. There were several things about the site that we thought perhaps suggested something fairly late in the evolution and development of Lodge Hill. One is the narrow entrance that I'm about to walk into now. But there's also a small inner enclosure, which may also be fairly late. And if you look carefully, you see the Iron Age multivallation, it's called. There's a bank, a ditch, a bank, another ditch, a bank beyond, and a ditch beyond that. But look at the ramp which has been built to accommodate this entrance. Look at the way the ramp fills in the ditches and cuts through the banks. This makes a nonsense of the Iron Age defences. And for that reason, amongst others, we think that perhaps this is all very late in the scheme of things. When we excavated this site, of course with scheduled site consent from Cadw after a contour and geophysical survey, we opened 3 main trenches. One trench was opened in the entrance, one looking at the rampart, the bank, the ditch over in this direction, and then a large open area excavation to try to see what was happening inside the hill fort. The entrance excavation did confirm that that was a late recut in the history of the site. The bank and ditch excavation was interesting because what we found there was that the revetment, a sort of a stone cladding on the banks, had been pulled down. People were slighting the fortress, and we think that was the Roman army, probably at about the same time they were building the fortress below us in Caerleon. And here, in the interior, a large roundhouse. At a different time, slightly offset, was a rectangular building, some sort of ancillary building, and then up above in the corner, confirmation of metalworking, ironworking, and, interestingly, evidence of 4th century reoccupation of Lodge Hill. So, where does that take us? We have an Iron Age Silurian hill fort, slighted by the Roman army in the aftermath of the Silurian War, reoccupied after the Roman army left Caerleon. Does that give us Arthur? Well, no, it doesn't. It gives us a reoccupied Iron Age hill fort. No, to find Arthur, we need to take a slightly different approach. And many would suggest that the best way to do that is to go down below into the legionary fortress at Caerleon, the fortress which was for some 200 years the home of the 2nd Augustan Legion. We've now come down off the hill fort and we're in the amphitheater just outside the fortress at Caerleon. And this is a great place to begin to understand how the amphitheater worked. As you see, we have a space here giving access onto the floor of the arena. And we have these benches. And you can imagine gladiators sat here on these benches about to go out into the arena. And it's not surprising that they were looking for a bit of divine intervention. And behind us, we have an altar dedicated to Nemesis, the Roman goddess of fate. And there are other things. Let's have a look in the amphitheater itself. There are all sorts of clues here in the amphitheater telling us about the way the fortress was built. For example, there's evidence reminding us that all of the construction in Caerleon was done by the army. You see, the Romans couldn't simply telephone a Silurian builder and say, will you knock me up an amphitheater? In the first place, the Silures didn't build amphitheaters, and in the second, they didn't very much like the Romans. Now, for proof of that, have a look at this. If you look closely, you can just about make out a C here. That's referring to a century or possibly a cohort. It's referring to a unit of men, and it's telling us that that unit of men were responsible for the construction or the repair of this bit of the wall. And there's more as well. Picture this amphitheater, half timbered above. You can, in your mind's eye, see it filled with 6,000 cheering, jeering Romans. But also think about what happens when the fortress is abandoned. Repairs stop, the wood decays, eventually the whole superstructure collapses, and before too long, what you have here is a huge, rounded mound. And interestingly, in the later Middle Ages, some people are already referring to that mound as Arthur's Round Table. So the amphitheater is interesting, and you may be thinking, crikey, Arthur's Round Table, we found him. But I always caution students to be cautious. We don't want to get carried away because in a very real sense, we're actually looking for at least two Arthurs. There's that early medieval warlord, but there's also the later Arthur, the Arthur of Camelot. And in many people's minds, the place to start looking for that Arthur is right here in Caerleon, or perhaps more to the point, right up there. That's Tennyson's window, it's in the pub, let's go and have a look at it. That second Arthur was to a very large extent a creation of the fertile imagination of Geoffrey of Monmouth. Now, one Welsh encyclopedia describes Geoffrey as a writer and pseudo-historian, but give him his due, he was a colourful character and he produced one of the most important books of the 12th century, his Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, hugely influential, much of it absolute nonsense. Some of it borrowed history, which was tweaked a little bit. For example, his British conquest of Rome. There he tries to hijack a well-established, well-documented Gaulish attack and turn it into a great British victory. But he wrote with conviction, and he was absolutely sure his Arthur was here in Caerleon. There may have been all sorts of reasons that Geoffrey wanted to place his Arthur in Caerleon. Certainly it was politically expedient, at least politically expedient for some people, like Robert Earl of Gloucester, the Lord of Newport, and Morgan ap Owain, the Lord of Caerleon. Now, Morgan was the grandson of Caradog ap Griffith, traditionally the last king of Gwent. But Morgan had managed to recapture Caerleon. Indeed, he'd recaptured virtually all the lands that his grandfather had ruled, except Newport. With Newport, he did a deal with Robert and formed an alliance which was very helpful for both men during the anarchy, the chaotic English civil war between Stephen and Matilda. It wasn't long before Morgan was styling himself Morgan the King, and Morgan's help was very important to Robert during the anarchy. We have a wonderful account from one chronicler of Robert's victory at the Battle of Lincoln, a victory which the chronicler puts down to a wild mob of Welshmen in the vanguard of Robert's army. That wild mob of Welshmen was provided by Morgan. And Robert, Morgan, and Morgan's successors as Lords of Caerleon had good reason to buy into the idea of Welsh kingship in Caerleon. So did Morgan's bards, his poets, who wrote about Arthurian tales. It's not surprising that by the later Middle Ages we were hearing about a round table here in Caerleon. And it may not be purely coincidental that when Geoffrey was writing his History of the Kings, his patron, the man who was paying the bills, was none other than Robert Earl of Gloucester. Whatever the case, it was a hugely influential book. For example, it influenced the tales of the Mabinogi, the Welsh triads. These were stories based on much earlier oral tradition, but they weren't actually written down until the era influenced by Geoffrey. But they do list a number of Arthurian sites, and the majority of those sites are in Gwent. And that wasn't all. The story spread and spread. Just look at some of these scholarly tomes published a few years ago by the University of Wales Press. Here's the Arthur of the English. This is another attempt to hijack the character. We have an early medieval warlord resisting the Saxons, transformed into an early English king. And it continues to spread. We have the Arthur of the French. The French were very good at embellishing the story. We pick up characters like Lancelot. And so it goes, the Arthur of the Germans, the Arthur of the Iberians. And eventually the story comes home, and perhaps the most important of all these texts, the Arthur of the Welsh. But by the time the story has made the circuit of Europe, we have an Arthur transformed. This is an Arthur with knights in shining armour, grail quests. This is Arthur full-blown, this is Camelot. And the story grew and grew. Tennyson, for example, when he sat and put pen to paper in this very window, he was content, he placed his Arthur here in Caerleon. And Tennyson was hugely influential as well. His work influenced, amongst other people, the pre-Raphaelite painters who provided a canvas for the Victorians and their successors, a sort of an Arthurian image which we still have with us today. And so it continues. From Mickey Mouse as an apprentice to a Merlin-like sorcerer, to a scantily clad, woad-painted, Boudica-like Keira Knightley in one of Hollywood's latest blockbuster interpretations. This second Arthur, this literary Arthur, goes from strength to strength. That second Arthur, that literary Arthur, that Arthur who's gone from strength to strength since Geoffrey's days, that's an Arthur worth having. That's a prize worth going for. And when you do, it opens the door to this legendary landscape. Just look from this vantage point. Over here, in the mist, there's Cadair Arthur, Arthur's chair. Down below, Mice Arthur, Arthur's field, a meadow. Further beyond, we have Tea Arthur, Arthur's house. And here on the Skirrid, Kissed Arthur, Arthur's chest. That literary Arthur, that's a tradition which has firmly stamped upon it, made in Wales. And going for that tradition opens the door to the glories of Gwent, to this amazing legendary landscape.